All right, hello, History 362, the Hellenistic world. Today I want to actually talk a little bit on the problem of, are the Macedonians Greeks? And in some ways, even though the Macedonian kingdom under Alexander the Great is going to really create the Hellenistic world through the explosive conquests that Alexander oversees, already there's a question in the 4th century of, are the Macedonians even Greeks? And this ties into what I think is a big theme of our course, namely the problem of Greeks and non-Greeks. And that problem is there at the very inception of the Hellenistic world. Now, the answer, of course, is it's complicated. Many Greeks did not consider the Macedonians to be Greek. Indeed, they considered the Macedonians. Greek critics, for example, note that the Macedonians drink unwatered wine. So if you're a Greek at a drinking party, a symposium, you'll dilute your wine with water, usually about 2/3 water to 1 part wine. And that way you can drink, it's, as we might say in the microbrew scene, your wine becomes sessionable. You can actually drink for a long time without getting roaringly drunk. The Greeks think that people who drink unwatered wine, undiluted wine, the way, say, we do today, that's kind of a barbarian thing. And of course, because you drink wine, people who drink wine unwatered can get drunk more quickly and lose control more quickly. Again, this is also, for Greek drinking, staying in control is important. And the Greeks look at Macedonians, Macedonian drinking parties and say, well, these guys get really drunk and really out of control really fast. And this practice is actually used to attempt to draw a distinction between us, the Greeks, who sort of stay in control, and those, the Macedonians, who are out of control and therefore not quite Greek. Now, it's hard to say whether this critique is necessarily true. That said, we do have a lot of evidence for how the Macedonian royal court works, and it does seem that extremely heavy drinking is a part of Macedonian courtly culture. So there may be something behind this critique. Now, another critique that we really can't confirm is that the Greeks say one thing that makes the Macedonians different from us is they have adult men with beards have sex with other adult men with beards. And the Greeks find this horrifying because for the Greeks, the sort of proper way to have a homosexual relationship, which they see as not only kind of normal, but maybe even at times more desirable than a man and a woman, is to have it with a boy. So an adult man with a boy. This is pederasty. This is a Greek form that, for those of you who are in 361, we ended up touching on a good deal. But the Greeks think that's perfectly okay, and that for two adult men, again, showing their adulthood with beards to have a sexual relationship, they think that's really gross. But they say the Macedonians do that. And again, just kind of shows that they're wild, uncontrolled, licentious. They don't sort of age out of pederasty and move on to sort of the heterosexual phase in life, which is what Greeks think a man by the time he's grown a beard should do. So here we have kind of judgment on the basis of praxis in the Greeks critiquing what makes the Macedonians different, what makes them weird, and we see those two things brought up. One other factor, of course, is language. And of course, language is difficult. The Greek itself has many different dialects that the Greeks acknowledge as Greek, Attic, Doric, Iolic, all a little different, all with slightly different sounds. And yet the Greeks sort of acknowledge, well, this is all sort of Greek, and we can kind of understand each other, even if, say, an Athenian thinks that a Spartan kind of talks funny because they speak a different dialect of Greek. Now, the distinction between a dialect and a separate but closely related language is always kind of an arbitrary one. In fact, linguists like to joke that the difference between a dialect and a language is that a language has an army and a navy. That's why Portuguese is a language, despite in many ways being a kind of strong dialect of Spanish in terms of the actual forms. There's no question that Macedonian as a language is closely related to Greek, although we don't really have enough of it because the Macedonians eventually start putting up their inscriptions in Greek. We don't really have enough of it, I think, to fully connect the differences. But without question, it's close related and probably would have been at least somewhat mutually intelligible for a Macedonian talking and someone who spoke an Attic or Doric or Iolic Greek. They might have been able to communicate. Now, there is some evidence linguistically that Macedonian is maybe slightly more related to Phrygian than it is to the Greek dialects, although Phrygian is also very, very, very closely related to Greek. So it's clearly a closely related language, although, again, it's not a dialect that most Greek speakers at the time would have themselves considered Greek. One difference that is at least notable is whereas a Greek might make a P sound, say an aspirated, either aspirated or unaspirated, like Philip, a Macedonian would make a B sound. So probably a name like Philip II would be pronounced Bilub. And obviously that's, you might be able to figure that out, but that is a difference in sound. And actually, it comes across most notably in the name Bernice, which is a Greek would call that Pherenike, bringer of victory, but a Macedonian would call it Berenice, which is not necessarily a common name, but it was my grandmother's name, and but that name is actually a Macedonian name that has come into English. So at any rate, there are some differences in language, although again, Macedonian it's a closely related language to Greek, and indeed, depending on how we define dialects, could potentially be considered a dialect of Greek. Now, that being said, when Greekness obviously involved both speaking a language and involving engaging in certain cultural practices, including how you drink your wine. But if there was one kind of moment where there's a sort of arbitrary, an arbitration of who is Greek or not, it's actually the Olympic Games. And in the late 6th century, the king of Macedonia, Alexander I, remember our Alexander the Great is actually Alexander III, but the king of Macedonia, Alexander I, manages to convince the people who run Olympia that he is Greek. He does this basically through a fictional genealogy that says that his ancestors came from Argos, the city-state of Argos, migrated up to Macedonia, became kings. But in this acceptance that, okay, the kings of Macedonia are Greek, is a kind of understanding, but they rule over either non-Greeks or not quite Greeks. And you might say that probably for much of the 4th century, that is kind of the sense, even as the Macedonian royal court is actually a center for kind of Hellenic culture. Kings like Alexander I and also his successors sponsor Greek poets. So Pindar, for example, the great poet Pindar spends some time in Macedonia. Euripides supposedly dies in Macedonia, and according to one story, torn to death in a terrible accident by the king's hounds. And supposedly his last and perhaps most famous play, The Bacchae, was written and produced initially in Macedonia. So there was a sense that throughout in the 5th and 4th century that the Macedonian royal court was a place of that sponsored Greek artists and philosophers and playwrights. The language of the royal court was indeed Greek. So you would sort of speak in an Attic dialect probably rather than in a again, whatever Macedonian was, whether you want to consider it a dialect or a language. And of course, you could make a kind of comparison, say, to the Prussians of the 18th century, where the kings of Prussia sponsor a court where everyone speaks French. You find all these French literates like Voltaire in the court of Prussia, but then you have the court, the kingdom itself speaks a different language, in this instance, German. That might be kind of how the Greeks view Macedonia, that there's these non-Greek population, even if there is a cultured court that actually sort of acts as a kind of grand salon for Greek intellectuals and artists. Again, already there's this kind of negotiation of, well, are the Macedonians Greeks? Well, their kings are, but the people aren't. To a degree, as we'll see, is as the Hellenistic sort of period progresses, the Macedonians, in some ways, become more Greek. In part because the use of Greek, say, for inscriptions becomes widely adopted. So you find a ton of Greek forms in Macedonia in the 4th or 2nd century. So you might say that in some ways Macedonia itself Hellenizes. But at least in the 4th century, before the conquests of Alexander the Great, the Macedonians are seen again as not quite Greeks, semi-Greeks. The kings are Greek, but the people aren't. So already we have that dichotomy of Greek and non-Greek, even as the power of Macedonia is going to create the Hellenistic world. So at any rate, those are just kind of some thoughts there. We'll talk a little bit more later this week on Macedonia and Alexander's career before his conquest of the Achaemenid Empire launches. So we'll talk soon.